Captain Wentworth was come to Kellynch as to a home, to stay as long as he liked, being as thoroughly the object of the Admiral's. I'm Ellen.
And I'm Harriet, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're reading chapters 9 and 10 of Persuasion. So let's start with your 100-word summary. And let me say this is the most easy 100-word summary I've ever had to deal with. I had some words left over. Did you find the same?
Not quite, but nearly. Captain Wentworth is flirting with both Henrietta and Louisa, to the annoyance of Charles Hayter, who has an attachment to Henrietta. One day when Anne is looking after little Charles, Wentworth and then Charles Hayter walk in. Little Walter climbs onto Anne's back and won't get off, but Wentworth comes over and removes him. Everyone goes on a walk planned by Louisa that ends up at Winthrop, where Henrietta is reconciled with Charles Hayter. Wentworth clearly admires Louisa's determination, but also notices that Anne is tired and gets the Crofts to give her a lift home in their gig.
Right. Well, I focused on some quite different things. Captain Wentworth continues to visit Uppercross almost daily. Anne watches the relations between him and the Musgrove girls and Henrietta's neglect of her cousin Charles Hayter. Little Walter climbs on Anne's back and Captain Wentworth removes him. Louisa organises a long walk with the intention of healing Henrietta's breach with Charles Hayter. Mary insists on coming too with her husband and Anne. Anne overhears Captain Wentworth praising Louisa for her firmness in pursuing her aim, and Louisa gives her views on Anne. The party encounters the Crofts, and Captain Wentworth compels Anne to accept a lift in their gig. I think they fitted together pretty well.
Yeah.
Yet, but the things you said a lot about, I said nothing. Things I felt you'd left out.
Yeah. So in the last couple of chapters we looked at, it was all about Captain Wentworth sort of rejecting Anne, saying he thinks she's changed, focusing on everyone else and just ignoring her. But I think in these two we start to see him being more aware of Anne.
What we start to see is his unspoken response to her, which shows that he's conscious of her and what's happening to her.
Yeah, but before that, we get the introduction of Charles Hayter and the relationship of Henrietta and Charles, and also Mary's attitude towards it.
Yes.
Which is another really funny piece of Mary.
I think that's one of the things that I was going to say a bit later, is how almost the whole comic element of this book, almost from here on, is Mary.
There's a little bit of gentle comedy with Admiral and Mrs. Croft.
Yes.
But it's all of the really funny stuff is Mary and Charles through to up until Anne goes to Bath.
Yes.
And even then a bit.
One of the things I had written down to think about was how completely now Jane Austen seems to have solved the problem of the information dump. Remember in the earlier books? She was always giving all this information. Now, in the introduction to this chapter, she's got to give all this information about Charles Hayter, about curacy, a lot of stuff. And it slides in perfectly.
Yeah.
She starts to talk about him in straightforward narrative language, and before long we've got Charles and Mary arguing about it, which gives Charles the chance to give that long account of what's really good about the Winthrop property.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. Because we do get this picture of, again, more of the social hierarchy. So you've got the Elliots at the top, then you've got the Musgroves, who are like the next most important family in the county.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Hayters, who are definitely a step below. But one of the things that is made clear is that the Winthrop property it's freehold. They've got the estate at Winthrop, which is not less than 250 acres, and they've got a farm at Taunton, which is some of the best land in the country.
Yes.
So they've got a lot of freehold property.
Yes. He is what you could have called a yeoman farmer, but eventually, probably, it'll be turned into him being a gentleman farmer.
Yeah. And the parents are saying it's not a great match for Henrietta, but if she liked him, and she does seem to like him, they're quite happy with it. But then after that, we sort of jump back to Charles and Mary with Anne thinking about whether Captain Wentworth likes Louisa or Henrietta better.
Yes.
Mary is adamant that Wentworth is more interested in Henrietta because Mary wants Wentworth to be more interested in Henrietta.
Yes.
Charles doesn't really seem to care all that much which of them, though I think he maybe leans more towards Louisa. That clash between Mary being all huffy about Henrietta has no right to throw herself away, considering the alliances the Musgroves have made, i.e. with the Elliots, and then Charles saying, I've liked Charles Hayter all my life and I'm not going to stop now.
The richness Jane Austen has of showing the way relations between families are there, how they interact, she can do it with such economy.
Yeah.
I just sort of think, as a piece of sort of social observation, that observation she's got there, which she finds comic, of the way the whole Musgrove family stick together.
Yeah. I like the way that you see that Charles and Mary are bickering about this, but they're not fighting about it. It's just kind of reflective of the way they're jogging along. They're not an ideal marriage by any stretch of the imagination, but they're both just getting on with it.
And they're interacting all the time.
Yes.
I mean, they're terribly aware of one another.
Yeah.
They want one another all the time.
Yeah. Charles Hayter doesn't really emerge as much of a person in this, although I will say, moving on to the big event of the chapter, which is little Walter climbing on Anne's back.
Yes.
Again, it's such a lovely scene because first Wentworth arrives and then Charles Hayter arrives, and Wentworth is just so oblivious to this.
He has no idea that he's being regarded as a rival.
Yeah. And yet Charles Hayter doesn't come across all that well in this scene because he won't talk to Wentworth. He just picks up the newspaper, so Wentworth goes back to looking out the window. And then when little Walter comes in and gets on Anne's back, all Charles will do is... Walter, cried Charles Hayter, why do you not do as you are bid? Do you not hear your aunt speak? Come to me, Walter. Come to Cousin Charles. This is a 2-year-old.
Can I just say something about the actual thing that little Walter does?
Yeah.
Because when I read that, I was remembering one of my grandmother's stories about herself as a young mother and how she was in the house alone with her younger son, who was a 2-year-old. And she was scrubbing the floor, and he came and got up on her back, sort of starting to ride her. And she said how helpless she was. She felt if she moved in any direction, she's going to knock the little kid down on the floor. You know, if she sits up, he'll fall. If she tosses him sideways, so there's no way she can lift her arms to get hold of his hands. I mean, you know, she was really sort of quite scared for a little while. Being alone in the house and put in this position, and he wouldn't get down. She said, get down, Jack.
He probably thought it was the bestest game ever.
Well, I mean, he was just going, sort of doing a ride on us. He probably did that with his older brother and sister. They'd let him ride on their backs.
And then Wentworth takes little Walter off her back.
And it's where she introduces one of those very homely things that can happen to people. I suppose what it reminds me a little bit of is Edmund and Fanny writing the letter to her brother.
And she can't do it because she doesn't know where to find ink or paper.
Yes.
And Edmund helps her. Yeah.
Yes, which is something that truly happens, but is not any sort of cliche for books.
The notes in my Cambridge edition say that Maria Edgeworth, when she read the book, particularly liked both the scene where Anne first encounters Wentworth, but also the scene when he takes little Walter off her shoulders. So we get this quite visceral, the description. In another moment, however, she found herself in the state of being released from him. Someone was taking him from her, though he had bent down her head so much that his little sturdy hands were unfastened from around her neck, and he was resolutely borne away before she knew that Captain Wentworth had done it. Her sensations on the discovery made her perfectly speechless. She could not even thank him. She could only hang over little Charles with most disordered feelings. And then it says, produced such a confusion of varying but very painful agitation as she could not recover from, till enabled by the entrance of Mary and the Miss Musgroves to make over her little patient to their cares and leave the room. She could not stay. It's got that same degree of emotion as the first scene when he walked into the room and she saw him for the first time in 8 years.
Yes. It's just the most wonderful little scene, isn't
Yeah.
it?
But that's sort of the first moment we have of Wentworth doing something nice for Anne.
And he is aware of her, and his awareness of her is going to be increasing.
Yeah.
Well, right up till he wants her to stay and look after Louisa.
Yeah. So chapter 10 is the walk to Winthrop, which is so much happens in it. But I just wanted to start out by saying that as I was rereading this chapter, I noticed there are so many things in it that just seem designed to push Wentworth's buttons. I'm just going to list these now before we start talking about the chapter proper. First of all, Louisa says that if she loved a man like Mrs. Croft loves the Admiral, she would rather be overturned by him than carried safely by anyone else. And that must make him think back of the time that Anne didn't love him enough to face down her family or to believe in him and to take risks. Then you have Mary being disdainful of the haters and of Winthrop, just as her family were disdainful of him 8 years ago. Then you have Louisa telling him that Henrietta was nearly persuaded by Mary not to go and talk to Charles like she planned to do. And then he learns that Anne also refused Charles and that people think that Lady Russell again persuaded Anne. So it's like all of these things are happening to bring back all his bitterness against Anne. And then at the end of the chapter we have the scene with the Crofts. So it's just such a rich chapter.
And the other thing with all of these, we see it through Anne's eyes. So all of these things is Anne thinking she knows what Captain Wentworth's feeling.
And that's actually where the chapter starts, with Anne trying to interpret what's happening. She keeps out of any discussions between Charles and Mary, but she does have...
Well, she feels she has too much inside knowledge to buy in on that.
Well, it says she'd been in company with them often enough to have an opinion, though too wise to acknowledge as much at home, where she knew it would have satisfied neither husband or wife. But then we have the bit where the action of the chapter properly starts, which is Louisa and Henrietta rocking up at Uppercross Cottage and saying, "We're going on a long walk and you won't want to come with us."
Well, they should have said, "And would you come with us?" And then Mary would have gone all huffy and saying, "A long walk? I can't do a long walk. I'm much too tired to do a long walk." They're not very good at manipulating Mary.
As Anne says, it's kind of ridiculous that they feel obliged to call in, unless you assume that to get from the Great House to Winthrop, they had to literally walk past the cottage. And if they'd been seen walking past the cottage...
On the other hand, perhaps they think, if we don't tell her where we're going, what we'll have to put up with when she finds out we did something and didn't invite her.
And then, of course, Wentworth and Charles turn up. So, this walk that had been planned by Louisa and Henrietta is just the two of them. To accidentally bump into Cousin Charles, I think, now has the two of them, and Mary, and Anne, and Charles, and Captain Wentworth. So that's 6 people going on this walk.
Yes.
And we have another one of these moments of Jane Austen just kind of gently poking fun at Anne, or almost Anne stepping back and laughing at her own emotions, when it says that in spite of the fact that she's reciting all this poetry to herself, it was not possible that when within reach of Captain Wentworth's conversation with either of the Miss Musgroves, she should not try to hear it.
Yes.
So she's not...
That's sweet.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd forgotten that.
So it's not like she completely accidentally overhears the conversation about the Crofts. It's just when she is within earshot, she stops thinking about other things and she's listening.
Well, I mean, the whole point is she's monitoring Captain Wentworth's behaviour from the moment he first reappears and interpreting it this way and interpreting it that way.
Because when he is present, she is so aware of him.
And she's got this whole project going of working out what he feels about their relationship in the past, what he feels about Louisa and Henrietta. She's monitoring him like mad.
And of course, the conversation she overhears is them talking about the Crofts and the lovely picture it gives us of the Crofts' relationship. That Admiral Croft obviously isn't all that good a driver of their gig.
Yes.
But Mrs. Croft still she's with him the whole time. And Louisa's statement, "If I loved a man as she loves the Admiral, I would always be with him. Nothing should ever separate us, and I would rather be overturned by him than driven safely by anyone else." Which, like I said earlier, must be pushing Wentworth's buttons about Anne.
Yes.
And then when they get to Winthrop, it's described as being without beauty and without dignity.
Yes.
So presumably when Charles Hayter does inherit, he will improve the property.
Yes.
Or knock it down and build a completely new one.
Yes.
Yes, and then it's an indifferent house standing low and hemmed in by the barns and buildings of a farmyard.
We're back to being able to compare it with the Martins' house,
Yeah.
where they had added an extra parlour, hadn't they? And they were getting some extra servants.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing there is probably what Henrietta will do once she's married to him. And she presumably brings a bit of a dowry with her.
Yeah. But they would still have been a bit above the Martins.
Oh, yes.
There's his freehold.
Yes, because the Martins are tenant farmers and these are freehold people.
Yeah. They arrive at Winthrop, and again we have the comedy of Mary being so discontented. I don't want to go down there. I'm too tired. The walk back up the hill would just make me more tired, even if I had a rest at the bottom. I'm just going to stay where I am. Yeah. I think we should go home now. Thank you very much. The scene where Anne overhears Wentworth and Louisa, of course, that's kind of a parallel to the end of the book where Wentworth overhears Anne and Captain Harville. And I'm not sure I've got a lot to say about the fact that Wentworth is rhapsodising over the fact that Louisa is so firm in her opinions and won't be persuaded by anyone.
No, well, I mean, we need that.
Yeah.
Because that explains Louisa's behaviour in life.
Yeah.
That he has planted that idea in her head that if she's got an opinion, she's got to stick with it.
If she wants to do something, she should do it.
I mean, he's not saying you should always go your own way. He's saying if you decide you want to do something, you should do it.
Yeah.
But of course, this is something serious, not jumping off a set of stairs.
Yeah. But what I've always been a little bit puzzled by, until just for this read when I was noticing how the chapter seems designed to make Wentworth continually reflect on the past, is the fact that when Louisa tells Wentworth about, you did know that Charles wanted to marry Anne, and Wentworth says, and she refused him, and Louisa says, yes, we think Lady Russell persuaded her.
And you feel like saying to Louisa, shut up about that.
Well, it's kind of always puzzled me as to why you get this misinformation to make Captain Wentworth think something that's not true, when Louisa could just as easily have said even Lady Russell couldn't persuade her to accept him. And as I said, it wasn't until this read through when I suddenly realised, okay, maybe Jane Austen did that, so it's just one more way of reminding Wentworth about the past and making him resentful of what Anne did 8 years ago.
Instead of being able to think Anne was true to me.
Yes, you kind of get that second of him thinking Anne was true to me when he pauses before saying and she refused him, to then immediately go on and we think Lady Russell did it, so he can immediately go back to thinking, oh, Lady Russell again.
Yes. It's just another lovely piece of Jane Austen and Anne. Anne goes through those feelings of, now he knows I had another chance and I wouldn't take it.
Yeah.
And then you get Louisa coming in with this other explanation. Oh, she would have, but Lady Russell wouldn't let her.
Yes, I was so annoyed with Louisa for doing that. And after all of this, then we still have the walk back home, where now there's 7 of them because Charles Hayter has joined them. And then the Crofts turn up. And this emphasis on Anne being tired, the Crofts have offered to give anyone who wants a lift.
Yes.
And Mary, who complained about being tired, obviously doesn't want a lift.
Well, she's just being contrary.
Yeah. And then Captain Wentworth has a quiet word to them and they insist on taking Anne with them.
Well, the bit I want to talk about there is the description of how Captain Wentworth turns up. It says that the Admiral was putting his horse in motion again when Captain Wentworth cleared the hedge in a moment to say something to his sister. I mean, what does cleared the hedge mean? Does it mean he leapt over it? Which suddenly we've got this very active picture of him over the hedge. It may mean he just pushed it out of the way, but I think it's interesting that she used that word, which in a sense comes from hunting.
Yeah.
Well, this is in the early days of enclosure, so perhaps the hedges aren't very high, but he's still jumped over a hedge.
Maybe he sort of puts one hand on the stile and jumps over.
Well, that's the sort of thing I'm imagining. He puts his hand on it and jumps over.
So maybe the hedge is only about waist high.
it just gives sort of an even more active picture of him as the sort of person who does things, who's comfortable with his body and is always prepared to do things. Just a very interesting description of the way he moves about when he wants to go somewhere in a hurry. He just leaps up over the hedge.
Yeah. But then we get Anne's emotions as Wentworth is doing this, and it says that, yes, he had done it. She was in the carriage and felt that he had placed her there, that his will and his hands had done it, that she owed it to his perception of her fatigue and his resolution to give her rest. So this is, again, the same sort of almost visceral physical response to him that she had when he took little Walter off her back.
Yes.
But then it goes on to give probably the clearest we've had so far of her analysis of his feelings, when she says, she understood him. He could not forgive her, but he could not be unfeeling. Though condemning her for the past, and considering it with high and unjust resentment, though perfectly careless of her, and though becoming attached to another, still he could not see her suffer without the desire of giving her relief. It was a remainder of former sentiment. It was an impulse of pure, though unacknowledged friendship. It was a proof in his own warm and amiable heart, which she could not contemplate without emotions so compounded of pleasure and pain that she knew not which prevailed. So do we think she's right in her analysis of what he's feeling? I've kind of always believed her.
I more or less go along with that.
Yeah.
I think she's right.
Yeah. Or at least she's right in what he thinks his feelings are.
Yes.
Because later he acknowledges that deep down underneath, where he wouldn't admit to it, he never actually stopped loving her.
Yes, from the end of chapter 9, we've got this new picture of Captain Wentworth being alert to Anne's feelings.
Yeah. He noticed, like no one else did, that she genuinely was tired.
Yes, which is lovely of him.
Particularly given everything that's just happened in that chapter that is continually reminding him of
the things he holds against her, yes.
Yeah.
Then there's this tiny little other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is particularly in that chapter about the walk. I think we get a sort of a picture that the whole of the area has been pulled together to have enclosures, that everything there is about the land being enclosed. It could have been enclosed a long time ago, but even so, we've got the Crofts are interested in their sheep, which suggests they have meadows which are set aside, and when they're on their walk, they come to an enclosure, and there's the plough going up and down because the harvest is over.
Yeah, it's November.
It's November, so they're ploughing up the land for winter, and the whole place is full of planted hedges, which again went with enclosure. There's also the meadows, and they've also got hedges alongside the main pathways, which are property definers as well as...
So I guess what you're saying is it looks like Mr. Shepherd has quite possibly been very active, and obviously we're getting this positive picture of enclosure and not getting the other side of enclosure of the enormous hardship it was causing.
Well, I'm just interested in trying to work out which places had probably been through enclosure acts and which hadn't. And you can't tell from this one.
Yeah.
Because, after all, if they're doing sheep and they've got meadows, that often came from an earlier enclosure.
So, favourite sentences. Do you want to go first or will I?
Oh, you go first.
Well, mine is from Admiral Croft, and it's when he's talking about the Miss Musgroves, and he says, "And very nice young ladies they both are. I hardly know one from the other."
On top of Mary, I suppose we have got the Crofts as another piece of humour.
Yeah, but it's so much more gentle humour. She's so indulgent. She obviously loves Admiral Croft to bits, and she doesn't actually like Mary, but she's created her as a comic character.
Yes. Well, my favourite sentence is coming from Mary as a comic character. It isn't a single sentence. It's when they're talking about how much money Captain Wentworth's made.
Yeah.
And Mary is talking, and she says, "Dear me, if he should rise to any very great honours, if he should ever be made a baronet, Lady Wentworth sounds very well. That would be a noble thing indeed for Henrietta. She would take place of me, and Henrietta would not dislike that. Sir Frederick and Lady Wentworth, It would be but a new creation, however, and I never think much of your new creations.
It's so Mary.
I put down another couple, but I don't stick with that because it brought up the idea of placement, which is what I talked about in episode 2.
Yeah. The characters we're talking about this episode are Louisa and Henrietta. And I'd like to start by just following on from my favourite sentence, because really, up until chapter 10, they were pretty much interchangeable.
Well, we don't actually hear all that much from them. What we tend to have is we've got Anne observing them, and she observes them as behaving in the same sort of way.
We have had dialogue with a name attached, but it hasn't been enough to distinguish them from each other. And to be honest, I think Louisa emerges as a person in chapter 10. Henrietta never really does.
Yes.
So we're told from Anne's perspective that Louisa is the more lively and...
As far as Anne's observation reached, Henrietta was perhaps the prettiest. Louisa had the higher spirits, and she knew not now whether the more gentle or the more lively character was most likely to attract Captain Wentworth.
Yeah, but that's almost the first distinction we've had between the two of them. But throughout chapter 10, we do get Louisa emerging and is coming across as quite lively.
Yes. Could we talk about the comparison between them and the Bertram sisters?
Yeah.
Because we've got what looks like a similar situation.
Yeah.
Where some lovely man has appeared.
Yeah.
And they each want to be with him.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
Well, part of that possibly depends on what you think Louisa's motivation was for the walk to Winthrop. Was it that she had observed that Charles is unhappy and Henrietta's conflicted, and she thinks that Henrietta has just sort of been dazzled by Captain Wentworth but really loves Charles and she wants to get them back together, which is nice? Or is it in fact she wants Captain Wentworth for herself and she wants to get rid of Henrietta? I think that is the kind of behaviour we would have got from Maria and Julia.
Yes.
I'm inclined to think that Louisa is being nice. Yes. I'm inclined to think she's not actually trying to do down Henrietta.
Well, what you're basically saying is that they probably hadn't even moved to which does he like best. They were still having a lovely time together.
Yeah.
And it's, after all, Charles Hayter is a lot more interesting than Mr. Rushworth.
Yeah. And what you don't have is that moment in Mansfield Park where Henry Crawford is put on the spot and actually has to make a choice.
Yes.
And he chooses Maria,
yes,
which really angers and upsets Julia. And then he tries to get Julia on side as well,
yes,
and she's not having any of it. And then he just shrugs his shoulders and goes, oh well. But
yes,
Captain Wentworth is never asked to choose between the two.
I mean, the point is Louisa fixes it up for him so he doesn't have to.
They have a much more distinct, I want him for me.
Yes.
Whereas the Musgrove girls, as you said, they haven't yet got to the point of thinking, I want him for me.
Not really, no. In a sense, when Henrietta realises that Charles has pulled away from her, she's upset. Louisa knows she's upset and tries to sort of get them together again.
Yeah, I think in the conversation with Captain Wentworth, you get the impression that she feels that this was what Henrietta wanted, and yet at the last minute she was going to turn away from it.
And Louisa blames Mary, which I think is probably not really fair.
I think it's not fair to say Henrietta was convinced by Mary's snobbish approach to the Hayters, but I do think Mary throwing up a barrier was enough to make Henrietta falter. Not the reason she did it, but just
the very fact of
it being more difficult, of there being opposition.
Yes. Well, I'm not even sure of that, but I mean, I think it's interesting to make that comparison between them.
Yeah.
Another thing that I thought is worth discussing is why do Anne and Jane Austen think that neither of those girls is good enough for Captain Wentworth?
Well, that's what I thought. Everyone in the book whose opinion we might respect seems to think of them as basically a bit lightweight. Because I copied this out. First of all, we've got Anne, who would not have given up her own more elegant and cultivated mind for all their enjoyments. And then we have Mrs. Croft saying that they're very good-humoured, unaffected girls indeed, which she says in a tone of calmer praise, such as made Anne suspect that her keener powers might not consider either of them as quite worthy of her brother. And then we've got Lady Russell. Obviously, we may have slightly conflicted views about Lady Russell's opinions, but internally her heart revelled in angry pleasure, in pleased contempt that the man who at 23 had seemed to understand somewhat of the value of an Anne Elliot should 8 years afterwards be charmed by a Louisa Musgrove. And then after that, we even have Captain Wentworth saying, I regard Louisa Musgrove as a very amiable, sweet-tempered girl, and not deficient in understanding, but Benwick is something more. He is a clever man, a reading man, and I confess that I do consider his attaching himself to her with some surprise. So Admiral Croft is just saying, they're lovely girls. Yeah. Everyone else is saying, they're lovely girls, but...
Yes, and what is it they haven't got?
Let's be fair to them. They're considerably younger than Anne. They're probably about the same age as the Dashwood girls and slightly younger than Maria and Julia. So maybe they're still just a tiny bit immature, which is, It's unfair to think that they're not going to develop. They're still barely out of adolescence. They're wild for dancing. They like playing the harp. They like going for long walks. They've got enthusiastic about the Navy. It is all, I guess, a little bit superficial, but it's not like they're Lydia and Kitty.
No, well, they're obviously not mad for any sort of male.
Yeah.
They do see there's something special about Captain Wentworth, even if, they can't quite distinguish it.
They're presented as a really lovely pair of sisters.
Yes, and lovely to one another.
And lovely to one another, and to Anne.
And to Mary and Charles.
I suppose one thing you can say is part of the reason they're a bit lightweight is they've never been challenged in anything. Until Louisa has her fall, or I suppose until Henrietta has to make a decision about Charles Hayter, everything has been easy for them. Except, of course, for the death of poor Richard.
Well, not really, because they hadn't seen poor Richard for years and years when he died.
Mm. And, of course, they know themselves to be superior to their Hayter cousins.
Yes.
They've been to school, they know stuff, they've been educated.
Probably only superior in the extent of knowing the way you're supposed to get up and sit down and a few things like that, which they've probably been teaching their cousins ever since they went to school.
Yeah. Oh, they probably also know some of the things that at a younger age the Bertram sisters were surprised that Fanny didn't know. But I wonder, while Anne likes them but feels this comfortable sense of superiority, do they recognise Anne as being superior to them?
Oh, I think they do. But on the other hand, Mary hasn't got any of those qualities.
Yeah.
Mary has also been to a school, and probably a much more high-class school than they were ever sent to. And yet Mary is just as frivolous as they are in the sense of having a serious attitude to life, of doing any sort of self-examination, the way Anne is always doing self-examination. Mary is not doing any.
Yeah.
I suppose that may be part of the reason other people think of them as frivolous, that while they're not terribly self-indulgent and self-deceiving like Mary, they never really behave like Fanny and think, is this the right thing to do, what are my motives? They flitter along on the surface.
Because they've never been challenged. I do think Henrietta is less developed than Louisa. They're interchangeable up until chapter 10, but Louisa is so much more dominant and Henrietta is so much more in the background. Jane Austen sort of develops Louisa almost to the detriment of Henrietta. After Lyme, we never see Louisa again, but we do see Henrietta again when they come to Bath.
Yes, that's so true.
But Henrietta still just hasn't really emerged as a personality in the way Louisa and Mary and Anne and Elizabeth and Mrs. Croft have all emerged as personalities. Although, of course, I've just realised there is the bit in Lyme when she's on the walk with Anne and she's talking about Dr. Shirley and she's pretending to be so concerned about Dr. Shirley's health and he needs someone to help him and maybe he should move to Lyme, which he could do if he had a responsible curate. It's not Mary level of self-deception or disingenuousness, but it's kind of moving a little bit in that direction.
Yes. Well, that's something in Irene Collins's book on the English Church. She thinks Jane Austen must have heard an awful lot of engaged girls talking in that particular way.
Mm.
The point is, in the way Jane Austen's had her behave in that scene, you feel indulgent towards her. You don't feel, as you do with Mary, this is a terribly selfish person putting herself forward. You feel this is just a rather sweet woman who's trying to turn everything towards her.
Yeah. But I suppose the other thing you get, which we didn't talk about except you mentioned it briefly, is the development in Louisa, in that in chapter 10 you have Captain Wentworth telling her not to be turned back. And then, of course, she takes that and runs with it
and uses that in a very foolish way, in thinking that he has told her to sort of go for what she wants rather than do what she thinks is right.
Yeah. But no, at the end, they're nice. They're two lovely sisters.
Yes. In the historical talk for today, Harriet persuaded me to do curates because this is the first time of all the clergy we come across a real curate in Jane Austen. Just as Mr. Elton was our only vicar, I think Charles Hayter is our only curate that we actually meet and speak to. Anyone reading about the beneficed clergy of Jane Austen's England, of the widespread pluralism and absenteeism that's holding more than one living or holding a living but never turning up there, might wonder whether there were any services for most of the population to attend on Sundays, whether they ever got themselves baptised or married or buried. But in fact these offices did continue to be performed, even if in a perfunctory and hurried sort of manner. They were carried out by an army of ordained but unbeneficed clergymen, that's clergymen without livings, the curates. Parish priests were in fact obliged by the Stipendiary Curate Act of 1713 to make sure there was someone to conduct a Sunday service in all the parishes to which they had been appointed, and it was accepted that these substitutes would be paid. The Act suggested between £20 and £50 a year. In some cases, this money was paid to a clergyman who had a living quite close to the vacant one. They'd pay him £10 a year to do the services for them or something like that. One is left with a picture of all over the country these clergymen who'd get up in one parish and hold a service, then leap on a horse to ride off to another place, while at this other place there'd be the sexton standing beside with the bell rope in his hand and the little boys looking out the road and rushing up to him saying, he's coming, and so he'd pull the bell, and then the people who dressed up in their Sunday clothes would know to go and be waiting for him in the church. In other cases, they hired a clergyman who had not yet got a parish, and so an income of his own, who was called a curate, to take the services. We do not really meet any curates in Jane Austen until we come to Persuasion, though we do hear that Dr. Grant hires one to do most of his parish work, and that Henry Crawford assumes Edmund will hand very much of this work over to one. But Charles Hayter seems to be set on the standard career path of the more conscientious clergy of his day. Having obtained a university degree, he had been ordained as a clergyman, and though still living at home, was now learning his trade by working under an experienced clergyman in a parish 6 miles away.
So is that what it means when it says it didn't require residency? I thought part of the point of having a curate was for the clergyman to be non-resident, so get the curate to do all the day-to-day stuff. But if he's non-resident as well, that means that the clergyman himself is resident and the curate is literally helping him rather than doing his job.
Yes, and which is probably the sort of curate Dr. Grant had, but also anyone with a biggish parish. But anyway, he's living at home, but he goes over on a Sunday, or he goes over and does the weddings and the funerals, or he goes round and visits the people. But obviously he's not there very often. He's starting off as a curate, but with an expectation that he may get a living through the interest of some connection they have with the bishop. This was the smooth way to getting a living, the way country gentry like the Bertrams, who owned the presentation of the parishes near their estates, got them for their sons, the way people like Jane Austen's father and eldest brother, who had rich relatives who would buy the presentations of a little cluster of parishes for them, and they could serve with the help of a curate or two who was a future vicar or rector in training. But this was the system working at its best. What of all the clergy whose parishes, when clubbed together, made a gentleman's income, but were scattered tens and even hundreds of miles apart? What they tended to do was deals with curates, particularly curates who wanted to get married, to come and live in these parishes, sometimes but not necessarily in the official parsonage, and for a fraction of the money the incumbent got, they would perhaps have the use of the parsonage and even perhaps some of the sort of farmland attached. In Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen seems to imply that a great many of them were very badly off. When Mrs. Jennings thinks Lucy Steele and Edward Ferrars have lost their chance of a living, she exclaims, "Wait for his having a living. Aye, we all know what that will end. They will wait a 12-month, and finding no good comes of it, will set down upon a curacy of £50 a year, with the interest of his £2,000. Then they will have a child every year, and Lord help 'em, how poor they will be." And yet there were always plenty of curates around looking for work. So where did all these curates come from? What encouraged them to enter a profession on terms Mary Crawford described as absolute madness, if you remember? What? Take orders without a living? No, that is madness indeed. Absolute madness.
Yeah, because in a talk given at the Jane Austen Society of Australia conference, they said that I think only about 40% of curates actually got a living.
Yes, well, a very large proportion never got a living.
Yeah.
And in fact, in Trollope you find them hanging around cathedral towns looking out for any work they can get. But what I'm going to say now is largely my own view of where all these curates who did all this work came from. It just seems to me that the English education system provided one way for a man to rise up the class system, through the universities, and that a great many men probably went to the university with the hope that they would be upwardly mobile in this way. Look at Mr. Elton, coming from a family in trade, but now he's on the road to becoming a JP and controlling the whole county. By 1831, about a quarter of the JPs in England were clergymen. So what we saw happening in Emma, in this collection of men who were getting together on parish business, and Mr. Elton's in with them, we can see that, he had a pretty good chance of becoming a JP and not earning more money, but having the prestige. It's surprising how often, when you simply look up the life history of scholars and scientists of the 17th and 18th century, one finds they're described as men who came from humble circumstances but made names for themselves after studying at Oxford and Cambridge. So if you become a clergyman, or if you go to a university, you may do really well. Most of them didn't, but all the same. And there was the provision for this. Throughout the period, there were increasing numbers of grammar schools and private schools offering a pre-university grounding to the sons of local farmers and tradesmen. If they were clever, intellectual boys who enjoyed the life of the mind, they could then go on to university. And by Jane Austen's time, many grammar schools and university colleges had university scholarship open to the cleverest boys throughout the country. Once they became clergymen, it was up to them. If, like Edmund Bertram, they had family livings already being held for them, or if, like Mr. Collins, they found a patron to whom they appealed, they were lucky. If not, they faced the future outlined by Mrs. Jennings, and here at least, because of the easy life chosen by the pluralists, there was a variety of low-paid work available to them. To finish up, in the last chronicle of Barset, written by Anthony Trollope in the 1850s, he created two characters who were outstanding scholars and friends at their college in the 1820s. One of them, who gets on well with other men and is an admired writer and a good administrator, becomes Dean of Barchester. The other, who is stern and harsh and opinionated, remains a perpetual curate on £130 for the rest of his life.
The adaptation I'm talking about today is the 2007 ITV version of Persuasion, which had Sally Hawkins as Anne and Rupert Penry-Jones as Captain Wentworth. Now, one thing that's just generally notable about it is there's a lot of close-ups of faces, often from a slightly low angle, or sometimes there's massive long shots with two tiny figures, but you can hear the dialogue, which is a little odd. And it also has a lot of use of handheld camera. So in this production, Sally Hawkins, who plays Anne, is 31, and Rupert Penry-Jones, who plays Captain Wentworth, is 37. So they're a bit older than they should be, but not too much, and the age difference between them is a little bit more than it should be, but again, not too much. Rupert Penry-Jones is a lot prettier than Ciarán Hinds was in 1995. Maybe looks a little bit less like someone who might have been at sea for a long time.
Yes.
And Sally Hawkins as Anne Elliot, I guess, like so many of the others, I don't really get a sense of getting her bloom back throughout it.
Yes.
Another thing she does that was done in the Spanish version, they give her some voiceover, mostly when she's writing in a journal. Obviously, it's because there's so much interior emotional stuff from Anne in the book, and they're trying to explain it to the audience, whereas in 1995 it was done through acting and cinematography and placement, and I felt that certainly having a voiceover made it easier, but the 1995 one proved that it wasn't absolutely necessary. So Walter Elliot is played by Anthony Head, who I know best as he was Giles in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but he's another one where they haven't cast someone who is good looking and maybe going a bit to seed. They've cast someone who is a good character actor.
Yes.
Most of the other people in it I wasn't particularly familiar with, but one I was particularly familiar with is Mr. Musgrove is played by Nicholas Farrell. I first saw him way back when in Chariots of Fire.
Yes.
And he was also in the 1983 version of Mansfield Park. He played Edmund.
All right.
In addition to that, there are two people who were in the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice. Rosamund Stephen, who plays Henrietta, was Mr. Berg in Pride and Prejudice. And Peter Wright, who plays Admiral Croft, played Mr. Gardner in the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. And of course, that was only 2 years earlier. But I think that's quite nice because while Admiral Croft isn't the same personality as Mr. Gardner, they have a kind of similar role.
Well, actually, a bit brighter, I think.
Yeah. Now, like the 1995 one, this is not a miniseries. The 1995 version was 1 hour and 43 minutes. This version is 1 hour and 33 minutes, so it has to make even more cuts to the plot. This one starts with the house being packed up, with sheets being put over the furniture and Anne walking around with a ledger supervising everything.
Yes.
So Lady Russell turns up, she's been away, and Anne basically says, we've got too much debt. I've persuaded Sir Walter to leave as it's better than selling Kellynch.
Which they couldn't do anyway.
Well, that's an interesting thing in this adaptation, which I'll get to. So remember the fact that I've said at this point, Anne said it's better than selling Kellynch. Lady Russell asks who Admiral Croft is, and Anne explains that he's the husband of Mrs. Croft, who is the sister of Captain Wentworth. And it's in this discussion we get the Anne and Wentworth backstory. So when she arrives at Uppercross, the time frame feels very compressed, because it feels like Captain Wentworth has arrived at Kellynch practically straight away. Charles has fallen from a tree, and this is one of the things I didn't like. When they bring in little Charles, Anne doesn't just, as in the book, make sure he's comfortable and send for the apothecary and send messages. Anne looks at him and can tell that his collarbone is dislocated, and she puts it back in.
Unless somebody's had plenty of practice, that's one of those things. They had bone setters who had no medical training but had expertise in putting people back together.
Yeah. Wentworth's comment about wanting a wife, it's made not just to Admiral and Mrs. Croft, but it's at the dinner at Uppercross with everybody listening. The scene when he first sees her, I didn't feel had the emotional impact of the way they did it in 1995. Once again, like all the other adaptations, they don't have the scene of him taking little Walter off Anne's back. But they do have a kind of replacement for that.
All right.
In the walk to Winthrop,
Yes.
there's a bit where there's a log across a stream, and
Yeah.
everyone has to walk along the log.
Yeah.
And if I remember rightly, Captain Wentworth helps Henrietta and Louisa, and Charles helps Mary, and Anne is just following on at the end, and nobody's helping her, and she slips and falls off the log.
Oh.
And Captain Wentworth reaches down and helps her stand up. And the camera work in this, I think, is trying to capture the emotional reaction Anne has in the book when Captain Wentworth takes little Walter off her back. It's a bit close up and confused, and I think that's the intention, and I think it does work quite well. She stays behind while the others go ahead, and then catches up with them just in time to hear Louisa and Wentworth's conversation. This is quite interestingly filmed because it's mostly viewed from within the bushes, and I'm not sure you even necessarily get a clear sense that it's Anne overhearing it initially. So the scenes in Lyme, this is the first thing that I really, really, really disliked about this adaptation, which is that when Anne is talking with Benwick, the stuff she says to Captain Harville in Bath about women's constancy, it is transposed to this conversation, which just is...
What's the point?
Exactly. It destroys the most beautiful scene in the book.
While still keeping it.
Yes. I can only assume they decided they wanted a different way to end it, which I'll be talking about in a minute, but they didn't want to lose that dialogue, so they gave it in that conversation, and I was so annoyed with that decision. Then we have Louisa's fall off the stairs. I've said before, they all use different sets of stairs in Lyme. This uses the more solid set of steps, which are further down the cob. Louisa has her fall, and just as when little Charles had his fall and Anne knew how to reset the collarbone, when Louisa has her fall, Anne gets a piece of cloth and tells them to keep this pressed against the wound. Again, she obviously has some degree of medical knowledge, which she doesn't in the book. So she's not just organised and keeping her head and telling people what to do. She's also managing the medical emergency.
Yes.
So that was Lyme. It's bright and sunny when they arrive in Bath. Anne and Lady Russell have a conversation about Mr. Elliot, and Anne saying, I don't understand why he wants to get involved with the family again. And Lady Russell says nothing can stop him inheriting the baronetcy and Kellynch. Remember, earlier Anne said it's better than selling Kellynch. Now they obviously can't sell Kellynch because nothing can stop Mr. Elliot inheriting. Elizabeth is plainly jealous of the interest Mr. Elliot is showing in Anne, which I think is something new because Elizabeth in the book is completely oblivious to it.
Yes.
Just after Anne arrives in Bath, before much has happened in Bath, there's a quick shot back in Lyme, Captain Harville and Captain Wentworth. It's the scene that's only mentioned retrospectively in the book where he basically makes it clear that he thinks that Captain Wentworth and Louisa are practically engaged, and Captain Wentworth says, no, of course not. And he says, well, her family and the girl herself believe that. And Wentworth looks appalled and says, what am I going to do? And Captain Harville suggests he just go away for a bit, which he does. Anne receives a letter from Charles in which it's clear that they expect Louisa to become engaged very soon, without naming a name. So Anne obviously thinks it's Wentworth, and there's a scene of her crying in her room.
They put a new misunderstanding in.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then shortly after, we have another scene back in Lyme. Captain Harville and Captain Wentworth on the Cobb. It's so windy, there's spray everywhere, there's waves crashing over the Cobb. And Captain Wentworth tells Captain Harville how perfect Anne is, and then says, but I must go to Uppercross and see Louisa. Yeah. And then Captain Harville says, have you read the letter Benwick sent you? I only ask about this because in this letter he tells you that he has proposed to Louisa and she has accepted. At which point Captain Wentworth looks delighted. Then Admiral and Mrs. Croft arrive in Bath, and they have a conversation with Anne and spend quite a bit of time talking at cross purposes because Anne thinks they're talking about Louisa and Wentworth and they know they're talking about Louisa and Captain Benwick. I don't like scenes where people are talking at cross purpose. So I just kind of felt, come on, let's get to the point, which they eventually do. They have the scene in the shop where Captain Wentworth arrives. Wentworth turns up at the musical evening. And so everyone's gone in and sat down, and the conductor is just raising his arms when Wentworth stands up and walks out, which is very rude.
Yes.
And then Anne stands up and runs out after him, kind of like she did in the 1995 version, but almost worse here because the music is only just about to start.
Yes.
Once again, as the 1995 version did, they introduced content from the chapter that Jane Austen cancelled and rewrote.
Yes.
Which, again, I still find annoying. Anne receives a letter that Wentworth says he is leaving Bath today, but he will call on her at 11 o'clock because he has a question. He says that the Crofts have heard you're going to marry Mr. Elliot and you'll want Kellynch back, and she says that the Admiral is utterly misinformed. Captain Wentworth looks really pleased at that, which of course in the cancelled chapter is when they get reconciled. But in this one, Lady Russell, as in 1995, interrupts them and Captain Wentworth leaves. And this is where it gets very silly, in my opinion. Because he's left and she gets caught up with people for like no more than 10 seconds or so. But when she steps out the front door, he's nowhere to be seen. And most of the rest of it is Anne racing around Bath, trying to find Wentworth and always missing him.
And does she go on foot? Or
yes. So first of all, just after she leaves, she gets met by Mrs. Smith. And while they are walking along the street, she tells Anne about Mr. Elliot. Yes. And she also somehow knows that Mr. Elliot had also been promising to set Mrs. Clay up as his mistress. Now, how anyone else would know about that, I don't know. So Anne then starts running. She runs to Captain Wentworth's place, and Captain Harville answers the door and says he's gone with the Crofts to the pump room. And then gives her a letter that he had written and asked Captain Harville to deliver to Anne. So Anne is then running again to the pump room with her voiceover reading Captain Wentworth's letter. She arrives at the pump room. Admiral and Mrs. Croft are just leaving the pump room, and they say, oh, you just missed Frederick. He's gone to call on you at Camden Place. So then she's running to Camden Place, and they finally meet on the street. And she says, I'm in receipt of your proposal and I am minded to accept it. The final scene of this is he has bought Kellynch for her as a wedding present, which, remember at the start, they said it's better than selling it. Then they said Mr. Elliot will inherit it. Now suddenly it's back to Captain Wentworth can buy it. It was a nice scene to have her able to be back at Kellynch, but honestly, if you want to have an ending that's after the end of the book, I much preferred the 1995 ending that had her at sea with Wentworth.
Oh, yes.
As I said when we were talking about the 1995 one, it is my favourite of the adaptations that exist, but it still has some things in it I dislike.
Yes.
This one I don't think ever rises to the heights of the 1995 one.
Yes.
Although Rupert Penry-Jones is certainly prettier than Kieran Hinds to look at. Sally Hawkins is... I probably would have thought she was fine as Anne Elliot if I hadn't seen Amanda Root as Anne Elliot.
Yes.
And that decision about moving the conversation about constancy and having her running through Bath and missing him everywhere, it just didn't work for me.
Yes.
But at least they did still keep Anne more or less to the Anne of the book, which all of the adaptations to this point have done. Next time I'm going to be talking about one that doesn't. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be reading chapters 11 and 12 of Persuasion.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com. We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.